You're live.
Good evening. Oh, look in the camera. That's right.
Yeah. You look at the camera.
Hmm.
Hello.
Nice job on the lighting tonight. A little friendlier, maybe.
Yeah, I need all the help I can get.
Well, we're finding ourselves looking forward to this time and reading.
Especially this book.
Yeah.
It's crazy how appropriate it is for really, I guess, any time of turmoil. But that part's been pretty good. So, really good. We'll attempt, I guess, to get 2 chapters in again tonight.
Might go over
a few minutes. A few minutes. We're not going to try and do that, but we'll start reading, maybe. You want to start?
Well, sure.
And we're starting tonight, chapter 5. It is labeled as that too, but we'll start at chapter 5, and it kind of dives right in. She doesn't waste any time. So.
Yeah, the war's here. Huh? Invasion, chapter 5. The slender hands of the clock on the stair wall pointed to 9:25 as we left the dining room that night. That in itself was unusual in our orderly lives. I was 80 years old now, and promptly at 8:45 each evening, an hour sooner than formerly, he would open the Bible, the signal for prayers, read 1 chapter, ask God's blessing on us through the night, and by 9:15 be climbing the stairs to his bedroom. Tonight, however, the Prime Minister was to address the nation at 9:30. One question ate through all of Holland like a long-held breath. Would there be war? That sentence, just the way she wrote that, is so good. Ate like a long-held breath. Because there had been rumors for years. They've been hearing, her brother had written that paper.
Rose had written that in school, like this paper about how he saw the hatred growing.
Right. We circled up the step to Tante Jan's rooms, and Father went to warm up the big table radio. Excuse me. We don't warm up our radios anymore, so.
No.
We did not so often spend the evenings up here listening to music now. England, France, and Germany were at war. Their stations carried mostly war reports or code messages, and many frequencies were jammed. Even Dutch stations carried mostly war news, and that we could hear just as well on the small portable radio we kept now in the dining room, a gift from Pickwick the Christmas before. This, though, was to be a major broadcast. Somehow we all felt it merited the large old set with its elaborate speaker. We sat now, waiting for 9:30, tense and upright in the high-backed wooden chairs, avoiding, as if by a kind of premonition, the cushioned and comfortable seats. Then the Prime Minister's voice was speaking to us, sonorous and soothing. There would be no war. He had had assurances from high sources on both sides. Holland's neutrality would be respected. It would be the Great War all over again. There was nothing to fear. Dutchmen were urged to remain calm and to... The voice stopped. Betsy and I looked up, astonished. Father had snapped off the set, and in his blue eyes was a fire we had never seen before. It is wrong to give people hope when there is no hope, he said. It is wrong to base faith upon wishes. There will be war. The Germans will attack, and we will fall. He stamped out his cigar stub in the ashtray beside the radio, and with it seemed, the anger too, for his voice grew gentle again. Oh, my dears, I am sorry for all Dutchmen now who do not know the power of God, for we will be beaten, but he will not. He kissed us both good night, and in a moment we heard the steps of an old man climbing the stairs to bed.
It's just crazy. Yeah. At 80.
Yeah.
His fervor for the lives of men.
Right.
And his love for
the Father.
The love of God.
Betsy and I sat rooted to our chairs. Father, so skilled at finding good in every situation, so slow to believe evil. If Father saw war and defeat, then there was no other possibility at all. I sat bolt upright in my bed. What was that? There it was again. A brilliant flash followed a second later by an explosion which shook the bed. I scrambled over the covers to the window and leaned out. The patch of sky above the chimney tops glowed orange-red. I felt for my bathrobe and thrust my arms through the sleeves as I whirled down the stairs. My father's room, I pressed my ear against the door. Between bomb bursts, I heard the regular rhythm of his breathing. I dived down a few more steps and into Tante Jan's rooms. Betsy had long since moved into Tante Jan's little sleeping cubicle where she would be near the kitchen and the doorbell. I love how she describes the movement in the house because the house is so important.
Mm-hmm.
So we can feel the kind of awkward and urgent movement.
And their love of it, turn the lights out, we know exactly where to go.
Right. She was sitting up in the bed. I groped toward her in the darkness, and we threw our arms around each other. Together we said it aloud. War. We should have said that aloud, huh?
Yeah, sorry.
Just kidding.
I was reading.
Not to make light of it. We're not making light of it.
No, I'm honestly, I didn't say it because of the next line.
Right. It was 5 hours after the Prime Minister's speech. How long we clung together, listening, I do not know. The bombing seemed mostly to be coming from the direction of the airport. At last we tiptoed uncertainly out to Tante Jan's front room. The glowing sky lit the room with a strange brilliance. The chairs, the mahogany bookcase, the old upright piano, all pulsed with an eerie light. Betsy and I knelt down by the piano bench. For what seemed hours, we prayed for our country, for the dead and injured tonight, for the Queen. And then, incredibly, Betsy began to pray for the Germans, up there in the plains, caught in the fist of the giant evil loose in Germany. I looked at my sister, kneeling beside me in the light of burning Holland. Oh Lord, I whispered, listen to Betsy, not me, because I cannot pray for those men at all. Yeah, I would have been Corrie. I would have felt.
Yeah,
Corrie.
you would. I don't know if you'd have been nicest. You might have been punching me.
Right. Let's go to the weird.
But it is a real truth, though. She's still writing and remembering this from her 70s.
Right.
Looking back and saying how far she's come, actually, right? The pursuit of the Father for her.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah.
And it was then that I had the dream. It couldn't have been a real dream because I was not asleep, but a scene was suddenly and unreasonably in my mind. I saw the Groat Market, half a block away, as clearly as though I was standing there, saw the town hall and St. Bavo's and the fish mart with its stair-step facade. Then I watched a kind of odd old farm wagon, old-fashioned and out of place in the middle of the city, come lumbering across the square, pulled by 4 enormous black horses. To my surprise, I saw that I myself was sitting in the wagon, and Father too, and Betsy. There were many others, some strangers, some friends. I recognized Pickwick and Toos, Willem, and young Peter. All together, we were slowly being drawn across the square behind those horses. We couldn't get off the wagon. That was the terrible thing. It was taking us away, far away, I felt, but we didn't want to go. Betsy, I cried, jumping up, pressing my hands to my eyes. Betsy, I've had such an awful dream. I felt her arm around my shoulder. We'll go down to the kitchen where the light won't show, and we'll make a pot of coffee. The booming of the bombs was less frequent and farther away as Betsy put on the water. Closer by was the wail of fire alarms and the beep of the hose trucks. Over coffee, standing at the stove, I told Betsy what I had seen. Am I imagining things because I'm frightened? But it wasn't like that. It was real. Oh, Betsy, was it a kind of vision? Betsy's finger traced the pattern on the wooden sink, worn smooth by generations of Ten Booms. I don't know, she said softly, but if God has shown us bad times ahead, it's enough for me that he knows about them. That's why he sometimes shows us things, to tell us that this too is in his hands. I like even that there's the reference to the generations of Ten Booms. It makes me think about the Bible and the remembering of God's faithfulness to the generations of all of the families. And
we were talking about too, like this is about 7 years after the 100-year birthday.
37 is the 100-year party.
Right.
This is 41.
This is 41. So it's just 4 years after.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That's right.
So a lot is,
So really quickly, 100 years they're celebrating, and 4 years later there's war.
Right.
War.
You want to go?
Sure. For 5 days, Holland held out against the invader. We kept the shop open, not because anyone was interested in watches, but because people wanted to see Father. Some wanted him to pray for husbands and sons stationed at the borders of the country. Others, it seemed to me, came just to see him sitting there behind his workbench as he had for 60 years, and to hear, in the ticking clocks, a world of order and reason. You can imagine that.
Yeah.
I never opened my workbench at all, but joined Betsy making coffee and carrying it down. We brought down the portable radio too and set it up on the display case. Radio was Harlem's eyes and ears and very pulse rate. For after that first night, although we often heard planes overhead, the bombing never came so close again. The first morning, over the radio came instructions that ground floor windows must be taped. Up and down the Bartadora strap, shop owners were out on the sidewalk. There was an unaccustomed neighborhood feel as advice, rolls of adhesive, and tales of the night's terror passed from door to door. One store owner, an outspoken anti-Semite, was helping Wild, the Jewish furrier, put up boards where a pane of glass had shaken loose. The optician next door to us, a silent, withdrawn individual, came over and taped the top of our display window where Betsy and I could not reach. A few nights later on the radio carried the news we dreaded. The Queen had left. I had not cried the night of the invasion, but I cried now, for our country was lost. In the morning, the radio announced tanks advancing over the border, and suddenly, all of Harlem was in the streets. Even Father, whose daily stroll was as predictable as his own clock chimes, broke his routine to go walking at the unheard of hour of 10 a.m. It was as though we wanted to face what was coming together. The whole city united, as though each would draw strength from each other Hollander. And so the three of us walked, jostled by the crowd, over the bridge, on the Sparn, all the way to the great wild cherry tree, whose blossoms each spring formed such a white glory that it was called the Bride of Harlem. Mm-hmm. A few faded petals clung now to the new leafed branches, but most of the bride's flowers had fallen, forming a wilted carpet beneath us. A window down the street flew open. "We've surrendered!" The procession in the street stopped short. Each told his neighbor what we had all heard for ourselves. A boy of maybe 15 turned to us with tears rolling down his cheeks. "I would have fought. I wouldn't ever have given up." Father stooped down to pick up a small bruised petal from the brick pavement. Tenderly, he inserted it in his buttonhole. "That is good, my son," he told the youngster, "for Holland's battle has just begun." But during the first months of the occupation, life was not so very unbearable. The hardest thing to get used to was the German uniform everywhere. German trucks and tanks in the street. Germans spoken in the shops. Soldiers frequently visited our store, for they were getting good wages, and watches were among the first things they bought. Toward us, they took a superior tone, as though we were not quite bright children. But among themselves, as I listened to them excitedly discussing their purchases, they seemed like young men anywhere off on a holiday. Most of them selected women's watches for mothers and sweethearts back home. Indeed, the shop never made so much money as during that first year of war. With no new shipments coming in, people bought up everything we had in stock. Even the Winkle doctors, the shop daughters. Merchandise that had lain around for so long, it seemed part of the furniture. I think we have trinkets like that here.
Yes, let's get rid of the Winkle doctors.
The Winkle doctors. My mom's house is loaded with those. We even sold the green marble mantel clock with the twin brass cupids.
Just imagine that one.
The curfew too, at first, was no hardship for us, since it was originally set at 10 p.m., long after we were indoors anyway, in any case. What we did object to were the identity cards each citizen was to issue. These small folders containing photograph and fingerprints had to be produced on demand. A soldier or a policeman, the Harlem police were now under the direct control of the German commandant, might stop a citizen at any time and ask to see, oh great,
His card.
go ahead.
It had to be carried in a pouch about the neck. We were issued ration cards too, but at least that first year, the coupons represented food and merchandise actually available in the stores. Each week, the newspapers announced what the current coupons could be exchanged for. That was another thing that was hard to adjust to. Newspapers that no longer carried news, long glowing reports of the successes of the German army on its various fronts, eulogies of German leaders, denunciations of traitors and saboteurs, appeals for the unity of the Nordic peoples, but not news that we could trust. And so we depended again on the radio. Early in the occupation, Harlemers were ordered to turn in all private sets. Realizing it would look strange if our household produced none at all, we decided to turn in the portable and hide the larger, more powerful instrument in one of the many hollow spaces beneath the old twisting staircase. Both suggestions were Peter's. He was 16 at the time of the invasion and shared with other Dutch teenagers the restless energy and anger and impotence. Peter installed the table radio beneath the curve in the stairs just above Father's room and expertly replaced the old boards, while I carried the smaller one down to the big room and Dressman department store where the radio collection was being made. The army clerk looked at me across the counter. Go back.
Is this the only radio you own? Yes. He consulted a list in front of him. Ten Boom, Casper. Ten Boom, Elizabeth, at the same address. Do either of them own a radio? I had known from childhood that the earth opened and the heavens rained fire upon liars. But I met his gaze. No. Only as I walked out of the building did I begin to tremble. Not because for the first time in my life I had told a conscious lie, but because it had been so dreadfully easy. But we had saved our radio. Every night, Betsy or I would remove the stair tread and crouch over the radio, the volume barely audible, while the other one thumped the piano in Tante Jan's room as hard as she could to hear the news from England. And at the first news over the radio, the news in our captive press was much the same. And at first, the news on the radio and the news in the captive press was the same. The German offensive was everywhere victorious. Month after month, the Free Dutch broadcast could only urge us to wait, to have courage, to believe in the counteroffensive, which must surely someday be mounted. The Germans had repaired the bomb damage to the airport, and were using it now as a base for air raids against England. Night after night, we lay in bed listening to the growl of engines heading west. Occasionally, English planes retaliated, and then the German fighters might intercept them right over Haarlem. One night, I tossed for an hour while dogfights raged overhead, streaking my patch of sky with fire. At last, I heard Betsy stirring in the kitchen and ran down to join her. She was making tea. She brought it into the dining room where we had covered the windows with heavy black paper and set out the best cups. Somewhere in the night, there was an explosion. The dishes in the cupboard rattled. For an hour, we sipped our tea and talked until the sounds of planes died away and the sky was silent. I said goodnight to Betsy at the door of Tante Jan's rooms and groped my way up the dark stairs to my own. The fiery light was gone from the sky. I felt for my bed. There was the pillow. Then, in the darkness, my hand closed over something hard. Sharp, too. I felt blood trickle along a finger. It was a jagged piece of metal, 10 inches long. Betsy! I raced down the stairs with the shrapnel shard in my hand. I went back to the dining room and stared at it in the light while Betsy bandaged my hand. On your pillow, she kept saying. on your pillow. Betsy, if I hadn't heard you in the kitchen. But Betsy put a finger on my mouth. Don't say it, Corrie. There are no ifs in God's world, and no places that are safer than other places. The center of his will is our only safety. Oh, Corrie, let us pray that we may always know it. Wow, we need to know that every day now, don't we? The true horror of the occupation came over us only slowly. During the first year of German rule, there were only minor attacks on Jews in Holland. A rock through the window of a Jewish-owned store, an ugly word scrawled on the wall of a synagogue. It was as though they were trying us, testing the temper of the country. How many Dutchmen would go along with them? And the answer, to our shame, was many. The National Socialist Bond, the Quisling organization of Holland, grew larger and bolder with each month of occupation. Some joined the NSB just simply for benefits, more food, more clothing coupons, the best jobs and housing. But others became NSBers out of conviction. Nazism was a disease to which the Dutch, too, were susceptible. And those with an anti-Semitic bias fell sick of it first, of the disease. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was going to say there's a lot in here, whether you're an adult or a child or reading this, there's a lot that you might pause and read a little bit about or talk with your young people about what Nazism is. And I think it's helpful to try to dispel ideas that that it was just horrible people doing horrible things. And here is pointing to this, right? That the reasons people join them with certain ideologies, and just that even as Christians, we understand our hearts and that we are really susceptible to comfort, to wanting to be safe, to all these things that could lend us to falling into beliefs that kind of allow those things and to be present. So that's what I always would, in teaching these things, just like, let's not think of the Holocaust as this one thing that happened in this one period of history where people were weird and terrible. That this is humans being human,
right?
And that our only hope is our God,
right? Being able to pray for the enemy, right? Like that's the only thing different. Because she was really thinking here that all of her Dutch would surely never fall, and she's seeing that they were susceptible,
right?
And they fell sick.
Right.
On our daily walk, Father and I saw the symptoms spread. A sign in a shop window: Jews will not be served. At the entrance to a public park: no Jews. On the door of the library, in front of restaurants, theaters, even the concert hall, whose alley we knew so much better than its seats. It's crazy how stark that is. That all of a sudden someone just puts that in the window. A synagogue burned down and the fire trucks came, but only to keep the flames from spreading to the buildings on either side. One noon, as Father and I followed our familiar route, the sidewalks were bright with yellow stars sewn to coats and jacket fronts. Men, women, and children wore the six-pointed star with the word Jud, Jew, in the center. We were surprised as we walked at how many of the people we had passed each day were Jews. The man who read the world shipping news in the Grootmarkt wore a star on his neatly pressed business suit. So did the bulldog, his jowly face more deeply lined than ever, his voice as he fussed at his dog, sharp with strain. Worst were the disappearances. A watch, repaired and ready, hanging on its hook in the back of the shop, month after month. A house in Nolly's block mysteriously deserted, grass growing in the rose garden. One day, Mr. Kahn's shop up the street did not open. Father knocked on his door as we passed that noon to see if someone were ill, but there was no answer. The shop remained shuttered, the windows above dark and silent for several weeks. Then, although the shop stayed closed, an NSB family moved into the apartment above. We never knew whether these people had been spirited away by the Gestapo or gone into hiding before this could happen. Certainly public arrests with no attempt to conceal what was happening were becoming more frequent. One day, as father and I were returning from our walk, we found the rope marked cordoned off by a double ring of police and soldiers. A truck was parked in front of the fish mark. Into the back were climbing men, women, and children, all wearing the yellow star. There was no reason we could see why this particular place at this particular time had been chosen. Father, those poor people, I cried. The police line opened. The truck moved through. We watched till it turned the corner. Those poor people, Father echoed. But to my surprise, I saw that he was looking at the soldiers, now forming into ranks to march away. I pity the poor Germans, Corrie. They have touched the apple of God's eye. In reality, not just the Jews, in that.
Yeah.
We talked often, Father, Betsy and I, about what we could do if a chance should come to help some of our Jewish friends. We knew that Willem had found hiding places at the beginning of the occupation for German Jews who had been living in his house. Lately, he had also moved some of the younger Dutch Jews away from the nursing home. Not my old people, he would say. Surely they will not touch my old people. Willem had addresses. He knew of farms in rural areas where there were few occupying troops. Willem would be the one to ask. It was a drizzly November morning in 1941, a year and a half after the invasion. It was really 3 years after that, right? 40. As I stepped outside to fold back the shutters, that I saw a group of 4 German soldiers coming down the Bartelsdorfstraat. They were wearing combat helmets low over their ears, rifles strapped to their shoulders. I shrank back into the doorway and watched. They were checking shot numbers as they walked. At Wheels Furriers, directly across the street, the group stopped. One of the soldiers unstrapped his gun and with the butt banged on the door. He was drawing it back for another blow when the door opened and all 4 pushed inside. I dashed back through our shop and up to the dining room where Betsy was setting out 3 places. Betsy, hurry! Something awful is happening at Wheels. We reached the front door again in time to see Mr. Wheel backing out of his shop, the muzzle of a gun pressed against his stomach. When he had prodded Mr. Wheel a short way down the sidewalk, the soldier went back into the store and slammed the door. Not an arrest then. Inside, we could hear glass breaking. Soldiers began carrying out armloads of furs. A crowd was gathering in spite of the early morning hour. Mr. Wheel had not moved from the spot on the sidewalk where the soldier had left him. A window over his head opened, and a small shower of clothes rained down on him. Pajamas, shirts, underwear. Slowly, mechanically, the old furrier stopped and began to gather up his clothing. Betsy and I ran across the street to help him. Your wife, Betsy whispered urgently. Where's Mrs. Wheel? The man only blinked at her. You must come inside, I said, snatching socks and handkerchiefs from the sidewalk. Quick, with us. And we propelled the bewildered old man across to the Bayet. Father was sitting in the dining room when we reached it and greeted Mr. Wheel without the slightest sign of surprise. His natural manner seemed to relax the furrier a bit. His wife, he said, was visiting a sister in Amsterdam. We must find a telephone and warn her not to come home, Betsy said. Like most private telephones, ours had been disconnected early in the occupation. There were public phones at several places in the city, but of course messages went to a public reception center at the other end. Was it right to connect the family in Amsterdam with the trouble here? And if Mrs. Wheel could not come home, where was she to go? Where were the Wheels to live? Certainly not with a sister where they could be so easily traced. Father and Betsy and I exchanged glances. Almost with a single breath, we said, Willem. Again, it was not the kind of matter that could be relayed through the public phone system. Someone had to go, and I was the obvious choice. Dutch trains were dirty and overcrowded under the occupation. The trip that should have taken under an hour took nearly 3. Willem was not there when I finally reached the big nursing home just after noon. But Teen and their 22-year-old son Kik were there. I told them what had happened at the Bartelsdorfstraat and gave them the Amsterdam address. Tell Mr. Wheel to be ready as soon as it's dark, Kik said. But it was nearly 9 p.m., the new curfew hour, before Kik rapped on the alley door. Tucking Mr. Wheel's clothing bundle beneath his arm, He led the man away into the night. You pick up?
Sure. It was more than 2 weeks before I saw Kick again to ask him what had happened. He smiled at me, the broad, slow smile I had loved since he was a child. If you're going to work with the underground, taunted Corrie, you must learn not to ask questions.
This is her nephew, right?
Right. Like 30 years younger than her. Yeah. That was all we ever learned over the wheels. But Kick's words went round and round in my head. The underground. If you're going to work with the underground. Was Kick working with this secret and illegal group? Was Willem? We knew, of course, that there was an underground in Holland, or suspected it. Most cases of sabotage were not reported in our controlled press, but rumors abounded. A factory had been blown up. A train carrying political prisoners had been stopped, and 7 or 17 or 70 had made it away. The rumors tended to get more spectacular with each repetition. But always they featured things we believed were wrong in the sight of God. Stealing, lying, murder. Was this what God wanted in times like these? How should a Christian act when evil was in power? It's a great question to discuss. I know there are some discussion questions out there, but it's a good one to put out there.
We have president.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was about a month after the raid on the fur shop that Father and I, on our usual walk, saw something so very unusual that we both stopped in mid-stride. Walking toward us along the sidewalk, as so many hundreds of times before, came the bulldog with his rolling, short-legged gait. The bright yellow star had by now ceased to look extraordinary, so what? And then I knew what was wrong. The dogs. The dogs were not with him. He passed without seeming to see us. With one accord, Father and I turned around and walked after him. He turned a number of corners while we grew more and more embarrassed at following him without any real excuse. Although Father and he had tipped their hats to each other for years, we had never spoken and did not even know his name. At last the man stopped in front of a small second-hand shop, took out a ring of keys, and let himself in. We looked through the window at the cluttered interior. Only a glance showed us that this was more than the usual hodgepodge of bric-a-brac and hollow-seated chairs. Someone who loved beautiful things had chosen everything here. "We must bring Betsy," I said. A little bell over the door jingled as we stepped in. Astonishing to see the bulldog hatless and indoors, unlocking a cash drawer at the rear of the store. "Permit an introduction, sir," Father began. "I am Corrie Ten Boom, and this is my daughter, Cornelia." We should remember to introduce ourselves, in such a permit an introduction.
Yeah.
The bulldog shook hands, and again I noticed the deep creases in the sagging cheeks. "Harry DeVries," he said. "Mr. DeVries, we so often admire your affection for your bulldogs. We hope they are well." The squat little man stared from one of us to the other. Slowly, the heavy-rimmed eyes filled with tears. "Are they well?" he repeated. "I believe they are well. I hope that they are well. They are dead." "Dead," we said together. I put the medicine in their bowl with my own hands and I petted them to sleep. My babies, my little ones. If you could only have seen them eat. I waited, till we had enough coupons for meat. They used to have meat all the time. We stared at him dumbly. Was it, I ventured at last, was it because of the rationing? With a gesture of his hands, the little man invited us into a small room in the back of the shop and gave us chairs. "Miss Ten Boom, I am a Jew. Who knows when they will come to take me away? My wife, too, although she is a Gentile, is in danger because of her marriage." The bulldog raised his chin so high his jowls stretched taut. "It is not for ourselves we mind. We are Christians, Cato and I. When we die, we will see Jesus, and this is all that matters." But I said to Cato, "What about the dogs? If we are taken away, who will feed them? Who will remember their water and their walk? They will wait, and we will not come, and they will not understand. No, this way, my mind is at ease." "My dear friend," Father gasped. The the bulldog's hand, Father grasped the bulldog's hand in both of his. Now that these dear companions may no longer walk with you, will you not do my daughter and me the great honor of accompanying us? But
We'll
this,
be your dogs.
but this the bulldog would not do. It would put you in danger, he kept saying. He did, however, accept an invitation to come visit us. After dark, he said. And so one evening, the following week, Mr. DeVries came to the alley door of the Bayet, bringing his sweet, shy wife, Cato, and soon she and Harry were almost nightly visitors in Tante Jan's front room. The bulldog's chief delight at the Bayet, after talking with Father, were the tomes of British theology.
Jewish theology.
Oh, I said British.
Yes.
Sorry. I had the war in my mind.
Yeah.
They're bombing the British from... Okay. Were the tomes of Jewish theology, now housed in Tante Jan's big mahogany case. For he had become a Christian some 40 years earlier, without ceasing in the least to be a loyal Jew. A completed Jew, he would tell us smilingly, a follower of the one perfect Jew. The books belonged to the rabbi of Harlem. He had brought them to Father more than a year before, just in case I should not be able to care for them indefinitely. He waved a bit apologetically at the procession of small boys behind him, each staggering under the weight of several huge volumes. My little hobby, book collecting. And yet, old friends, books do not age as you and I do. They will speak still when we are gone to generations we will never see. Yes, the books must survive. As we, in our hands, clearly see to be true. The rabbi had been one of the first to vanish from Harlem. How often it is a small, almost unconscious event that marks a turning point. As arrests of Jews in the street became more frequent, I had begun picking up and delivering work for our Jewish customers myself, so that they would not have to venture into the center of town. And so one evening in the early spring of 1942, I was in the home of a doctor and his wife. They were a very old Dutch family. The portraits on the walls could have been a textbook of Holland's history. The Heemstras and I were talking about the things that were discussed whenever a group of people got together in those days. Rationing and the news from England. But down the stairs piped a childish voice. "Daddy, you didn't tuck us in." Dr. Heemstra was on his feet in an instant. With an apology to his wife and me, he hurried upstairs, and in a minute we heard a game of hide and seek going and the shrill laughter of two children. That was all. Nothing had changed. Mrs. Heemstra continued with her recipe for stretching the tea ration with rose leaves. And yet everything was changed. For in that moment, reality broke through the numbness that had grown in me since the invasion. At any minute, there might be a rap on this door. These children, this mother and father, might be ordered to the back of a truck. Dr. Heemstra came back to the living room, and the conversation rambled on. But under the words, a prayer was forming in my heart. Lord Jesus, I offer myself for your people, in any way, any place, any time. And then an extraordinary thing happened. Even as I prayed, that waking dream passed again before my eyes. I saw again those 4 black horses and the groat mark. As I had on the night of the invasion, I scanned the passengers drawn so unwillingly behind them. Father, Betsy, Willem, myself, leaving Harlem, leaving all that was sure and safe. Going where? A lot happened.
A lot, yeah.
41 and 42, now 5 years after the party.
Mm-hmm. And now this is chapter 6 starts. It was Sunday, May 10th, 1942, exactly 2 years after the fall of Holland. The sunny spring skies, the flowers, and the lamppost boxes did not at all reflect the city's mood. German soldiers wandered aimlessly through the streets, some looking as if they had not yet recovered from a hard Saturday night, some already on the lookout for girls, a few hunting for a place to worship. Each month, the occupation seemed to grow harsher, restrictions more numerous. The latest heartache for Dutchmen was an edict making it a crime to sing the Wilhelmus, our national anthem. Father, Betsy, and I were on our way to the Dutch Reformed Church in Velsen, a small town not far from Haarlem, where Peter had won the post of organist in competition against 40 older and more experienced musicians. The organ at Velsen was one of the finest in the country. Though the train seemed slower each time, we went frequently. Peter was already playing, invisible in the tall organ loft, when we squeezed into the crowded pew. That was one thing that occupation had done for Holland. Churches were packed. After hymns and prayers came the sermon, a good one today, I thought. I wished Peter would pay closer attention. He regarded sermons as interesting only to venerable relics like his mother and me. I had reached 50 that spring. To Peter, the age at which life had definitely passed by. I would beg him to remember that death and ultimately issues could come for any of us at any age, especially these days. But he would reply charmingly that he was too fine a musician to die young. Oh, the youth. The closing prayers were said, and then, electrically, the whole church sat at attention. Without preamble, every stop pulled out to full volume. Peter was playing the Wilhelmus. Father, at 82, was the first one on his feet. Now everyone was standing. From somewhere in the back of us, a voice sang out the words. Another joined in, and another. Then we were all singing together. The full voice of Holland, singing her forbidden anthem. We sang at the top of our lungs, sang our oneness, our hope, our love for Queen and country. On this anniversary of defeat, it seemed almost for a moment that we were victors. Afterward, we waited for Peter at the small side door of the church. It was a long time before he was free to come away with us. So many people wanted to embrace him, to shake his hand and thump his back. Clearly, he was enormously pleased with himself. But now that the moment had passed, I was, as usual, angry with him. The Gestapo was certain to hear about it. Perhaps they already had. Their eyes and ears were everywhere. I thought of Nolly, home fixing Sunday dinner for us and for us all. I thought of Peter's brothers and sisters and Flip. What if he lost the principalship of the school for this? And for what had Peter risked so much? Not for people's lives, but for a gesture, for a moment's meaningless defiance. At Boston Hovenstraat, however, Peter was a hero, and one by one his family made us describe again what had happened. The only members of the household who felt as I did were two Jewish women staying at Nolly's. One of these was an elderly Austrian lady whom Willem had sent into hiding here. Katrien, as the family had rechristened her, was posing as the von Werden's housemaid, although Nolly confided to me that she had yet so much as to make her own bed. Probably she did not know how, as she came from a wealthy and aristocratic family. The other woman was a young blonde, blue-eyed Dutch Jew with flawless false identity papers supplied by the Dutch National Underground itself. The papers were so good, and Anneliese looked so unlike the Nazi stereotype of a Jew, that she went freely in and out of the house, shopping and helping out at school, giving herself out to be a friend of the family whose husband had died in the bombing of Rotterdam. Katrien and Anneliese could not understand any more than I could Peter's deliberately doing something that would attract the attention of the authorities. I spent an anxious afternoon tensing at the sound of every motor, for only the police, Germans, and NSBers had automobiles nowadays. But the time came to go home to the Bayeux, and still nothing had happened. I worried 2 more days and then decided either Peter had not been reported or that the Gestapo had more important things to occupy them.
It was Wednesday morning, just as Father and I were unlocking our workbenches, that Peter's little sister Cocky burst into the shop. "Opa! Tante Corrie, they came for Peter. They took him away." "Who? Where?" But she didn't know, and it was 3 days before the family learned that he had been taken to the federal prison in Amsterdam. It was 7:55 in the evening, just a few minutes before the new curfew hour of 8. Peter had been in prison for 2 weeks. Father and Betsy and I were seated around the dining room table, Father replacing watches in their pockets and Betsy doing needlework, our big, black, slightly Persian cat curled contentedly in her lap. A knock on the alley door made me glance in the window mirror. There in the bright spring twilight stood a woman. She carried a small suitcase and, odd for the time of year, wore a fur coat, gloves, and a heavy veil. I ran down and opened the door. "Can I come in?" she asked. Her voice was high-pitched in fear. "Of course." I stepped back. The woman looked over her shoulder before moving into the little hallway. "My name is Clearmaker. I'm a Jew." "How do you do?" I reached out to take her bag, but she held on to it. "Won't you come upstairs?" Father and Betsy stood up as we entered the dining room. "Mrs. Clearmaker, my father and my sister." "I was just about to make some tea," cried Betsy. "You're just in time to join us." Betsy's always about to make tea or coffee. Father drew out a chair from the table, and Mrs. Clearmaker sat down, still gripping the suitcase. The tea consisted of old leaves which had been crushed and reused so often they did little more than color the water. But Mrs. Clearmaker accepted it gratefully, plunging into the story of how her husband had been arrested some months before, her son gone into hiding. Yesterday, the SD, the political police who worked under the Gestapo, had ordered her to close the family clothing store. She was afraid now to go back to the apartment above it. She had heard that we had befriended a man on the street. In this household, Father said, God's people are always welcome. "We have 4 empty beds upstairs," said Betsy. "Your problem will be choosing which one to sleep in." Then to my astonishment, she added, "First, though, give me a hand with these tea things." I could hardly believe my ears. Betsy never let anyone help her in the kitchen. "I'm just a fussy old maid," she'd say. But Mrs. Clearmaker had jumped to her feet with pathetic eagerness and was already stacking plates and cups. It's such a lovely, simple picture of hospitality, right?
Mm-hmm. And also her, you get a sense that she felt like she had hope again. Where living in where she was, it was always constantly waiting. When are they going to close the shop? When are they going to come get me?
Right.
And now it's like, stacking plates and cups. I can actually think of something mundane. Yeah, it really is beautiful.
Just 2 nights later, the same scene was repeated. The time was again just before 8 and another bright May evening. Again, there was a furtive knock at the side door. This time, an elderly couple was standing outside. "Come in." It was the same story, the same tight-clutched possessions, the same fearful glance and tentative tread, the story of neighbors arrested, the fear that tomorrow their turn would come. That night after prayer time, the 6 of us faced our dilemma. "This location is too dangerous," I told our 3 guests. "We're half a block from the main police headquarters, and yet I don't know where else to suggest." Clearly, it was time to visit Willem again. So the next day, I repeated the difficult trip to Hilversum. "Willem," I said, "we have 3 Jews staying right at the Bayet. Can you please get places for them in the country?" Willem pressed his fingers to his eyes, and I noticed suddenly how much white was in his beard. "It's getting harder," he said, "harder every month. They're feeling the food shortage now, even on the farms. I still have addresses, yes, a few, but they won't take anyone without a ration card." "Without a ration card? But Jews aren't issued ration cards." "I know." William turned to stare out the window. For the first time, I wondered how he and Teen were feeding the elderly men and women in their care. "I know," he repeated. "And ration cards can't be counterfeited. They're changed too often and they're too easy to spot. Identity cards are different. I know several printers who do them. Of course, you need a photographer." "A photographer? Printers? What was Willem talking about?" "Willem, if people need ration cards and there aren't any counterfeit ones, what do they do?" Willem turned slowly from the window. He seemed to have forgotten me and my particular problem. "Ration cards?" he gestured vaguely. "You steal them." I stared at this Dutch Reformed clergyman. "Then, Willem, could you steal? I mean, could you get 3 stolen cards?" "No, Corrie, I'm watched. Don't you understand that? Every move I make is watched." He put an arm around my shoulder and went on more kindly. "Even if I can continue working for a while, it will be far better for you to develop your own sources. The less connection with me, the less connection with anyone else, the better." Juggling home in the crowded train, I turned Willem's words over and over in my mind. Your own sources. That sounded so professional. How was I going to find a source of stolen ration cards? Who in the world did I know? And at that moment, a name appeared in my mind. Fred Cornstra. Fred was the man who used to read the electric meter at the Bayet. The Cornstras had a retarded daughter, now a grown woman, who attended the church. Clearly this was written at a time when that was the word that was used.
Yeah, it was used because of their knowledge.
Right.
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 So, yeah, that's
Just good to know.
definitional more than anything else.
Yeah. Who had attended the church I'd been conducting for the feeble-minded for some 20 years. And now Fred had a new job working for the food office. Wasn't it in the department where ration books were issued? That evening, after supper, I bumped over the brick streets to the Cornstra house. The tires on my faithful old bicycle had finally given out, and I had joined the hundreds clattering about town on metal wheel rims. Oh, it just...
You should ride one. They don't stay up very well either. You turn.
Each bump reminded me jarringly of my 50 years. Fred, a bald man with a military bearing, came to the door and stared at me blankly when I said I wanted to talk to him about the Sunday service. He invited me in, closed the door, and said, "Now, Corrie, what is it you really came to see me about?" "Lord," I prayed silently, "if it is not safe to confide in Fred, stop this conversation now before it is too late. I must first tell you that we've had some unexpected company at the Bayet. First it was a single woman, then a couple. When I got back this afternoon, another couple." I paused for just an instant. "They are Jews." Fred's expression did not change. "We can provide safe places for these people, but they must provide something too. Ration cards." Fred's eyes smiled. "So, now I know why you came here. Fred, is there any way you can give out extra cards, more than you report?" "None at all, Corrie. Those cards have to be accounted for a dozen ways. They're checked and double-checked." The hope that had begun to mount in me tumbled. But Fred was frowning. "Unless," he began. "Unless there should be a hold-up. The food office in Utrecht was robbed last month, but the men were caught." He was silent a while. "If it happened at noon," he said slowly, "when just the record clerk and I are there, and if they found us tied and gagged," he snapped his fingers. "I don't know, just the man who might do it. Do you remember the—" "Don't," I said, remembering Willem's warning. "Don't tell me who, and don't tell me how. Just get the cards if you possibly can." Fred stared at me a moment. "How many do you need?" I opened my mouth to say 5. But the number that unexpectedly and astonishingly came out instead was 100.
Not even her words, right? I wonder, were they speaking English or Dutch?
Right.
Are they close together? You know,
True.
Cent, 1 and 100. 100. It's like, I guess God didn't stop the conversation.
Exactly, right? Clearly. Went places she didn't imagine.
When Fred opened the door to me just a week later, I gasped at the sight of him. Both eyes were greenish purple, his lower lip cut up and swollen. "My friend took it very naturally to the park," was all he would say. But he had the cards. On the table in a brown manila envelope were 100 passports to safety. Fred had already torn the continuing coupon from each one. This final coupon was presented at the food office the last day of each month in exchange for next month's card. With these coupons, Fred could legally continue to issue us 100 cards. We agreed that it would be risky for me to keep coming to his house each month. What if he were to come to the Bayet instead, dressed in his old meterman uniform? The meter in the Bayet was in the back hall at the foot of the stairs. When I got home that afternoon, I pried up the tread of the bottom step, as Peter had done, higher to hide the radio. I found a hollow space inside. Peter would be proud of me, I thought, as I worked, and I was flooded by a wave of lonesomeness for that brave and cocksure boy. But even he would have to admit, I concluded, as I stepped back at last to admire the completed hideaway, that a watchmaker's hand and eye were worth something. The hinge was hidden deep in the wood, the ancient riser undisturbed. I was ridiculously pleased with it. It's like, and all for deceit, right? Like this lovely deceit that she spent all of her watchmaking skill on. We had our first test of the system on July 1. Fred was to come in through the shop as he always had, carrying the cards beneath his shirt. He would come at 5:30 when Betsy would have the back hall free of callers. To my horror, at 5:25, the shop door opened, and in stepped a policeman. He was a tall man with close-cropped orange-red hair whom I knew by name, Rolf van Vleet, but little else. He had come to the 100th birthday party, but so had half the force. Certainly he was not one of Betsy's regulars for winter morning coffee. Rolf had brought in a watch that needed cleaning, and he seemed in a mood to talk. My throat had gone dry, but Father chatted cheerfully as he took off the back of Rolf's watch and examined it. What were we going to do? There was no way to warn Fred Cornstra. Promptly at 5:30, the door of the shop opened, and in he walked, dressed in his blue work clothes. It seemed to me that his chest was too thick by a foot at least. With magnificent aplomb, Fred nodded to Father, the policeman, and me. Good evening. Courteous, but a little bored. He strode through the door at the rear of the shop and shut it behind him. My ears strained to hear him lift the secret lid. There. Surely Rolf must have heard it too. The door behind us opened again. So great was Fred's control that he had not ducked out the alleyway exit, but came strolling back through the shop. Good evening, he said again. Evening. He reached the street door and was gone. We had gotten away with it this time, but somehow, some way, we were going to have to work out a warning system. For meanwhile, in the weeks since Mrs. Clearmaker's unexpected visit, a great deal had happened at the Bayet. Supplied with ration cards, Mrs. Clearmaker and the elderly couple and the next arrivals and the next had found homes in safer locations. But still, the hunted people kept coming, and the needs were often more complicated than ration cards and addresses. If a Jewish woman became pregnant, where could she go to have her baby? If a Jew in hiding died, how could he be buried? Develop your own sources, Willem had said. And from the moment Fred Cornstra's name had popped into my mind, an uncanny realization had been growing in me. We were friends with half of Harlem. We knew nurses in the maternity hospital. We knew clerks in the records office. We knew someone in every business and service in the city. We didn't know, of course, the political views of all these people. But, and here I felt a strange leaping of my heart, God did. My job was simply to follow his leading, one step at a time, holding every decision up to him in prayer. I knew I was not clever or subtle or sophisticated. If the Bayet was becoming a meeting place for need and supply, it was through some strategy far higher than mine. Now you go.
A few nights after Fred's first meterman visit, the alley bell rang long after curfew. I sped downstairs expecting another sad and stammering refugee. Betsy and I had already made up beds for 4 new overnight guests that evening, a Jewish woman and her 3 small children. But to my surprise, close against the wall of the dark alley stood Kik. Get your bicycle, he ordered with his usual young abruptness, and put on a sweater. I have some people I want you to meet. Now, after curfew? But I knew it was useless to ask questions. Kik's bicycle was tireless too, the wheel rims swathed in cloth. He wrapped mine also to keep down the clatter, and soon we were pedaling through the blacked out streets of Harlem at a speed that would have scared me even in daylight. This is so great.
Yes.
She's like a spinster, right?
Yeah.
Put a hand on my shoulder, Kik whispered. I know the way. We crossed dark side streets, crested bridges, wheeled round invisible corners. At last, we crossed a broad canal, and I knew we had reached the fashionable suburb of Ardenhout. We turned into a driveway beneath shadowy trees. To my astonishment, Kik picked up my bicycle and carried both his and mine up the front steps. A serving girl with starched white apron and ruffled cap opened the door. The entrance hall was jammed with bicycles. Then I saw him. One eye smiling at me, the other at the door, his vast stomach hastening ahead of him. Pickwick! He led Kik and me into the drawing room, where sipping coffee and chatting in small groups was the most distinguished-looking group of men and women I had ever seen. But all my attention, that first moment, was on the inexpressibly fragrant aroma in that room. Surely, was it possible? They were drinking real coffee? Pickwick drew me a cup from the silver urn on the sideboard. It was coffee. After 2 years, rich, black, pungent Dutch coffee. He poured himself a cup too, dropping in his usual 5 lumps of sugar as though rationing had never been invented. Another starched and ruffled maid was passing a tray heaped high with cakes. Gobbling and gulping, I trailed about the room after Pickwick, shaking the hands of the people he singled out. They were strange introductions, for no names were mentioned, only occasionally an address, and asked for Mrs. Smith. When I met my fourth Smith, Kik explained with a grin, "It's the only last name in the underground."
Smith.
So, this was really and truly the underground. But where were these people from? I never laid eyes on any of them. A second later, I realized with a shiver down my spine that I was meeting the national group. Their chief work, I gleaned from bits of conversation, was liaison with England and the Free Dutch forces fighting elsewhere on the continent. They also maintained the underground route through which downed Allied plane crews reached the North Sea coast. But they were instantly sympathetic with my efforts to help Haarlem's Jews. I blushed to my hair roots to hear Pickwick describe me as the head of an operation here in the city. A hollow space under the stairs and some haphazard friendships were not in operation. The others here were obviously competent, disciplined, and professional. But they greeted me with grave courtesy, murmuring what they had to offer as we shook hands. False identity papers, the use of a car with official government plates, signature, forgery. In a far corner of the room, Pickwick introduced me to a frail-appearing little man with a wispy goatee. Our host informs me, this little man began formally, that your headquarters building lacks a secret room. This is a danger for all, those you are helping as well as yourselves and those who work with you. With your permission, I will pay you a visit in the coming week. Years later, I learned that he was one of the most famous architects in Europe. I knew him only as Mr. Smith.
I'll just pause. We are at the hour.
Yes.
We're going to finish this, so
Yeah,
hang in.
trouble.
It's only a little bit longer.
Just before Kik and I started our dash back to the Bagay, Pickwick slipped an arm through mine. My dear, I have good news. I understand that Peter is about to be released. So he was, 3 days later, thinner, paler, and not a whit daunted by his 2 months in a concrete cell. Nolly, Teen, and Betsy used up a month's sugar ration baking cakes for his welcome home party. And one morning, soon afterward, the first customer in the shop was a small, thin-bearded man named Smith. Father took his jeweler's glass from his eye. There was one thing he loved better than making a new acquaintance. It was discovering a link with an old one. Okay.
Smith, he said eagerly. I know several Smiths in Amsterdam. Are you by any chance related to the family who... Father, I interrupted. This is the man I told you about. He's come to inspect the house. A building inspector? Then you must be the Smith with offices in the Groot Outstraat. I wonder that I haven't... Father, I pleaded. He's not a building inspector, and his name is not Smith. Not Smith? Together, Mr. Smith and I attempted to explain, but Father could simply not understand a person being called by a name not his own. As I led Mr. Smith into the back hall, we heard him musing to himself. I once knew a Smith on Coming Street. He looks nothing like him. Mr. Smith examined and approved the hiding place for ration cards beneath the bottom step. She was so proud to have shown that. He also pronounced acceptable the warning system we had worked out. This was a triangle-shaped wooden sign advertising Alpina watches that I had placed in the dining room window. As long as the sign was in place, it was safe to enter. But when I showed him a cubbyhole behind the corner cupboard in the dining room, he shook his head. Some ancient redesigning of the house had left a crawl space in that corner, and we'd been secreting jewelry, silver coins, and other valuables there since the start of the occupation. Not only the rabbi had brought us his library, but other Jewish families had brought their treasures to the Bayeux for safekeeping. The space was large enough that we had believed a person could crawl in there if necessary, but Mr. Smith dismissed it without a second glance. First place to look. Don't bother to change it, though. It's only silver. We're interested in saving people, not things. Mm-hmm. He started up the narrow corkscrew stairs, and as he mounted, so did his spirits. He paused in delight at the odd-placed landings, pounded on the crooked walls, and laughed aloud as the floor levels of the old two houses continued out of phase. What an impossibility, he said in an awestruck voice. What an improbably, unbelievable, unpredictable impossibility. Miss Ten Boom, if all houses were constructed like this one, you would see before you a less worried man. At last, at the very top of the stairs, he entered my room, and he gave a little cry of delight. This is it, he exclaimed. You want your hiding place as high as possible, he went on eagerly. It gives you the best chance to reach it while the search is on below. He leaned out the window, craning his thin neck. The little fawn's beard pointed this way and that. You can see him kind of turning. I'm picturing like a movie character.
Mr. Tumnus or something.
Yeah, that's right. But this is my bedroom. Mr. Smith paid no attention. He was already measuring. He moved the heavy, wobbly old wardrobe away from the wall with surprising ease and pulled my bed into the center of the room. This is where the false wall will go. Excitedly, he drew out a pencil and drew a line along the floor, 30 inches from the back wall. He stood up and gazed at it moodily. That's as big as I dare, he said. It will take a cot mattress, though. Oh, yes, easily. I tried again to protest, but Mr. Smith had forgotten I existed. Over the next few days, he and his workmen were in and out of our house constantly. They never knocked. At each visit, each man carried in something. Tools and a folded newspaper, a few bricks and a briefcase. Wood, he exclaimed, when I ventured to wonder if a wooden wall would not be easier to build. Wood sounds hollow. Hear it in a minute. No, brick's the only thing for false walls. After the wall was up, the plasterer came, then the carpenter, finally the painter. 6 days after he had begun. You can't get work done here for 6 days.
Can we hire this guy?
Mr. Smith called Father, Betsy, and me to see. We stood in the doorway and gaped. The smell of fresh paint was everywhere. But surely nothing in this room was newly painted. All four walls had that streaked and grimy look that old rooms get in coal-burning Harlem. The ancient molding ran unbroken around the ceiling, chipped and peeling here and there, obviously undisturbed for 150 years. Old water stains streaked the back wall, a wall that even I, who had lived half a century in this room, could scarcely believe was not the original, but set back a precious 2.5 feet from the true wall of the building. Built-in bookshelves ran along this false wall, old sagging shelves whose blistered wood bore the same water stains as the wall behind them. Down, in the far left-hand corner, beneath the bottom shelf, a sliding panel, 2 feet high and 2 wide, opened into the secret room. Mr. Smith stooped and silently pulled this panel up. On hands and knees, Betsy and I crawled into the narrow room behind it. Once inside, we could stand up, sit, or even stretch out, one at a time, on the single mattress. A concealed vent, cunningly led into the real wall, allowed air to enter from outside. Keep a water jug there, said Mr. Smith, crawling in behind us. Change the water once a week. Hardtack and vitamins keep indefinitely. Anytime there is anyone in the house whose presence is unofficial, all possessions except the clothes actually on his back must be stored in here. Dropping to our knees again, we crawled single file out into my bedroom. Move back into this room, he told me. Everything exactly as it was before.
I think you have 2 sentences.
Oh. With his fist, he struck the wall above the bookshelves. The Gestapo could search for a year, he said. They'll never find this one. It is funny. He's as proud of his work as she
Right.
was of her step.
Right,
You know?
right, yeah.
But it is this lovely, it's like they know exactly why they're doing it.
Right, I was gonna
So
say,
it
that's
is-
the urgency that got it done in less than a week.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, he was working to save lives.
Which, in all honesty, we have nothing urgent, that urgent. You
Right.
know, it is quite all right. Well, we hope you enjoyed, and we certainly did. So thanks for
Yes.
joining. And let's keep reading. Let's get together with the groups, and we'll be doing some question stuff. I've got to look ahead, but make sure everyone sign up.
I know.
It's a great story. So
Good to be with you all.
have a great evening.
Peace.
Good night.